And it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to our conversation this afternoon. Before we get started, I have a few small things that I'd like to share with you. First of all, I'd like to introduce Shula Cooper. Shula is our new Alumni Engagement Coordinator who started with us just about a week ago, and we're delighted to have her. You'll be seeing a lot more of her in the coming weeks and months and hopefully years as you progress from class member into alumni or engage with us in an alumni capacity. For those who are not familiar with Leadership Winston-Salem, Leaders in Lunch is a series that we host every month. We do it to keep our alumni engaged and connected with the community. We're just entering into our recruitment process right now for the flagship program. So if you're interested in learning more about Leadership Winston-Salem, please feel free to reach out to either myself or April Garner, or look on our website at leadershipws.org. If we have questions as we move forward through the webinar, please be sure to use the Q&A function and not the chat for questions, and Melissa will help facilitate those as we move through our program today. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Melissa Thompson, who is a graduate of the flagship class of 2020, best class ever. And Melissa is the Alumni Council Program Chair. Melissa?
Thank you, Catherine. It's good to be here today, and I especially want to thank our guest speakers. Dr. Wanda Allen-Abraha and Richard Angino are joining us today to talk about housing issues and to talk about how housing is impacted by systems that are in place and that can sometimes prevent or limit access and equity in housing, and how important housing is in living in a good life and to build wealth as well as we talk through this. So I'm going to introduce our two speakers. Read a little bio for both of them. Dr. Wanda Allen-Abraha is the Human Relations, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Department Director for the City of Winston-Salem. She began serving as the department head in 2001. Ms. Allen-Abraha is originally from Fayetteville, North Carolina, and she is the first female head of the Human Relations Department and was one of the youngest department heads hired in Winston-Salem city government. She has also the distinction of being the first person to lead the newly created Human Relations, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Department as of September 2021. She graduated cum laude and magna cum laude, respectively, from North Carolina Central University, while earning simultaneous bachelor's degrees in English and French. While in college, she was initiated into Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. She earned a Juris Doctorate degree from North Carolina Central University School of Law. Ms. Allen-Abraha is a graduate of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill Municipal Administration Program and Cornell University's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Certificate Program. She is also a senior certified professional of the Society of Human Resource Management. And before joining city government, Ms. Allen-Abraha served as the Equal Employment Opportunity Coordinator in the Human Resources Division of the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services. Before serving with the state government, she worked as a legal compliance specialist in the Human Resources Division of Elk Grove Unified School District in Elk Grove, California. Under her leadership in the Winston-Salem Human Relations Department, received the 2016 National League of Cities Cultural Diversity Award for the Building Integrated Communities Pipeline Program, and the 2018 University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill Institute for Study of the Americas Community Service Award for the department's diversity and inclusion work. Ms. Allen-Abraha is also a past recipient of the Triad Business Journal's 40 Leaders Under 40, the Winston-Salem Outstanding Women Leaders Award, the Indo-US Cultural Association's Diwali Award, and the Urban League's Unity Award. She was a 2015 City of Winston-Salem Employee Excellence in Leadership Awardee. That's pretty impressive, and we're very happy to have you here with us. And you are a past graduate of Leadership Winston-Salem as well. And then we also have joining us Richard Angino, who is the owner of Third Wave Housing, which is based in Winston-Salem. Third Wave Housing is a team that specializes in the development of both new historic multifamily properties. Richard has been on the development side of an industry since 2004 and has developed 20 properties which contain over 2,100 units. Prior to moving to his current role in the industry, Richard held various senior executive positions on the investor and equity syndication side within the tax credit industry since 1987, which involved funding over 450 properties. Most recently, Richard completed two 48-unit complexes called Essex Place in Winston-Salem and The Retreat at Pittsburgh. In 2019, Richard started a housing advocacy group in Winston-Salem called Folks for Good Housing. So we're happy to have both of you here today. And this is really going to be a conversation centering around housing and housing issues and how we got to be where we are today. And talking about the history of how we came here, I think is really important in understanding where we're at now and understanding the scopes of the challenges that we face in bringing access and equity to both fair and affordable housing. So we were going to talk about the redlining exhibit that's at the county library, and it's been up for a couple months, and they're extending the stay there as well. And we would encourage anyone who hasn't gone to see the exhibit to go ahead and take a look at it, because it really gives you a great understanding and history of redlining and its impact on housing and availability and accessibility and equity. And so, Dr. Wanda Allen-Abraha, is it okay for me to call you Wanda during the session?
Please call me Wanda, please.
Okay, I appreciate that. So the redlining exhibit exists here. Can you give us the basics of what redlining is?
Yes, and thank you so much to you, Melissa, and to the entire Leadership Winston-Salem team. I feel honored to be on this with Richard. I know I'm in very good company, so I look forward to the discussion as well. So redlining, of course, is a practice that was going on here in the United States prior to the Civil Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act and a lot of the laws that legally, of course, were required or derived from the practices that redlining involved. So with redlining, what would happen is government would actually sanction, and not only sanction, but mandate that neighborhoods would be racially segregated. And the redlining phrase comes from the fact that really there would be literal red lines on maps that would let banks know where mortgages could be made, where they could actually lend to people who were seeking to purchase housing. And it was also applicable to people who were renting housing. But anyway, the red lines would indicate the areas that were considered, quote, high risk. And instead of basically saying, well, you know, these are the Black neighborhoods, stay out of these, we're not going to lend over there, the red lines were just indicators to the banking industry and to governmental officials or anyone else as to what areas were considered to be risky. And so there weren't just red lines, you know, there were green lines, there were yellow lines, there were blue lines, and they all meant something different. But the redlined areas typically outlined what we would refer to as predominantly African-American neighborhoods in today's world.
All right, thank you for that. And there's in the exhibit, there's wonderful displays of the maps and examples of what that looked like and how it was presented. So definitely something to take a look at. And we did recently a presentation to the City Council that included that information as well. So it's interesting to see how these types of practices were created and how they were communicated and things that people knew about, but maybe weren't in, I don't know, documentation. So were these federally sanctioned programs?
Absolutely. They were federally sanctioned programs, and they actually were sanctioned right here also by our local government in Winston-Salem. And what I'm trying to do now is share my screen so that I can show you exactly what those redlined maps look like. But I see that for those images on the particular slides, for some reason, they're not showing up. And I they would. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. But
yeah. Well, and that's the one thing that people miss in the concept is basically when it was the FHA program and it was originated in the 1920s. And exactly. It basically was allowing, because prior to that, people were just buying houses in cash, or you borrowed money from someone down the street, or there was a lot of, but out of the financial crisis in the 1920s, they set up the FHA, which basically came up with how do you allocate money out there in the field. And they had very specific, for that time, very specific underwriting for how you get somebody a home loan. And this is really, so now this is 100 years ago, but it classified based upon neighborhoods, which is exactly what Wanda's referring to. It also went deep into, and it's somewhat troubling to read some of the documents, but they actually classify based upon somebody's history. So like for me, I'm German and Italian background. There's actually, if you were Southern Italy, you actually had a lower credit rating than if you were, from England originally. And so they had this whole classification where they broke everyone down into pieces and basically said, okay, we will only lend money, or banks are only allowed to lend money because they're all using federal money. They're only allowed to lend money to the following categories of people. And that's exactly what Rhonda is referring to. And that's where the Redline maps came out, as well as the insurance maps came out. So it kind of took it from the senior level, about the federal level, and pushed it down all the way into the cities. And all the cities had to change their zoning actually in the 1920s. And Winston did in 1930, change theirs, and had to classify every neighborhood as to if it's residential, if it's industrial, and exactly it actually had, I have one of the maps here, but it's basically like this, and put all these little tiny dots over and markings as to every neighborhood, and basically determined what neighborhoods should get money and what neighborhoods shouldn't. And I think that's one of the things that came out. We started working on where New Brunson's supposed to go, which is right above, they call it Industry Hills, which I don't like to call it Industry Hill, because reality in the 1920s, that was all residential houses. And that whole neighborhood was like the West End. And basically when the maps changed in the 1930s, that was all determined that it should be industrial, even though it was a thriving residential neighborhood. And so as soon as you shut off the federal money, which shuts off the lender money, nobody can buy a house without a loan. And so nobody can approve a house without a loan. And basically that shut off the cash. And that's the premise behind a lot of the redlining, was the ability to shut off the cash for multiple reasons, one of which was racial, but there was other reasons of trying to shut it off, both on the social economic side and also the ethnic side. But it's a troubling, I only got into it because I started working on a neighborhood over there to try to, and we realized that there used to be houses there, and we decided, okay, let's put the houses back in, which is a mission we've been on for the last 5 years, is trying to figure out how to put more residential closer to downtown.
But I think it is important to be mindful of the fact that most of this was driven by just government sanctioned discrimination. It was racism. And because a lot of the neighborhoods that were the most severely impacted tended to be historically African-American neighborhoods. We still see the repercussions of those practices today, even in our own local community, because I hate it that I can't show the map that I have. I'm still gonna work on that. But it's very clear that the redlined areas, even here in Winston-Salem, tend to be what we refer to as East Winston, and a significant part of downtown, particularly the northeastern little section of downtown. And so I just think that we really need to understand how those dots connect to what we see today, and the fact that the Civil Rights Act was birthed from a lot of the discriminatory practices that people were having to go through and suffer through back then. And Winston-Salem did change the maps here, of course, but they only changed those because they had to. There was a Supreme Court decision from the North Carolina Supreme Court that made them do that. And so we just have to really be mindful of the fact that, yes, there were these redlining laws and mandates and so on and so forth from the FHA, which is of course the federal level, but locally Winston-Salem and Asheville were the first two cities here in North Carolina to adopt a lot of those discriminatory practices that we're referencing now. And like I said, the ramifications were horrible in terms of Highway 52, of course. That was built under the guise of urban renewal and trying to plan accordingly and so forth, but it went right through traditionally African-American neighborhoods. And so those neighborhoods were basically decimated. And there were approximately 4,000 plus families that were displaced during that time. But even for the expansion of R.J. Reynolds and for the expansion of Winston-Salem State, in addition to the building of Highway 52, all of those things in the name of urban renewal and so forth really did have a negative impact on African-American families and neighborhoods here in Winston-Salem. And we've not really seen a full recovery yet. And a lot of what we're seeing today in terms of the transportation issues, barriers to accessible and affordable housing, and in terms of food insecurity in those very same areas that just happened to be redlined way back in the day, I don't think that was a coincidence in the least bit. We all know that. But it's just important to know that, because people often wonder, how did we get here? How did we end up that way? And so you have to go back and look at those practices. And again, it wasn't just government sanctioned, it was government mandated.
Right.
So that people were jailed if they attempted to violate those segregationist laws and policies. And so of course, we have case law on that as well. But it's just something I wanted to really emphasize. And I know that there were others beyond the African-American community who were negatively impacted, but really by and large, it was the African-American community.
Well, and it's still alive. I mean, this is the puzzle with redlining, because when we started preparing for this presentation, then part of it was referring back to the history of redlining, but we still have it happening. I mean, we just basically last year, we got North Carolina Housing Finance hands out housing tax credits, which is the biggest program to produce multifamily that's not market rate product across the country. And basically they have rules as to how the money can get allocated. And until last year, there was a rule that basically the neighborhoods were divided up by poverty neighborhoods and non-poverty neighborhoods. And basically we pushed back as folks for good housing. We were pushing back for about 4 or 5 years against this rule, because basically it said that they couldn't use federal money, which is in the form of these tax credits, could invest in any properties that were in poverty, zones of poverty. Now, every time I say that, people always say, well, you mean you should be investing in poverty? No. But depending upon how much poverty was in the neighborhood, you lose points for doing that. So we had Winston-Salem downtown, exactly the neighborhoods that Wanda is referring to. You couldn't get a new tax credit property to go into those neighborhoods, because you're basically competing with Clements and Kernersville and other places that have poverty rates of close to zero. Some places are actually zero. And if you look at Winston-Salem's map as a whole, almost all the census tracts have poverty that is above 30%. And so from day one, the system that they had set up with the logic of we just don't want to put money into places of poverty basically became a redlining in its own sense, because even improvements we were trying to do here in Winston-Salem, we couldn't get money for. Because the thought was, why do we want to put more money into these neighborhoods? Because these neighborhoods are struggling with the poverty side. At the same time, you kind of say, well, part of it is, and Wanda's 100% right, they spent a couple $2 billion dropping 52 and destroying these neighborhoods. And it's easy for us to say that wasn't right, but at the same time, to unwind a couple $1 billion worth of investment takes a lot of energy, and there's not another couple billion coming on the other side to kind of fix it. So we're basically trying to figure out, okay, how do we take the world that's created, and we're all kind of been born into it because it started back in the 1920s. And how do we kind of make this into a better place for it? And I think the big thing we've been pushing back on folks for good housing is making sure that we allow for new money to be going into some of these existing neighborhoods so we can make them better and try to undo some of the damage that was done in these areas.
Well, and this really shows how people who are born in those areas, when you look at the statistics of the ability to get out of poverty when you're born in these areas, is very minimal. That the statistics say that if you're born into poverty, into these areas where the redlining and the poverty levels are so high, the ability to work your way out of that is very difficult. And I think with homeownership,
and it's not moving out of it. That's the puzzle, is because most of the allocations of new deals have been they're on the border of Forsyth County, which means somebody's going to have to now drive to work. And you get to all the complications of, okay, now you're going to take somebody who makes $24,000. You're going to pull them out of their neighborhood because the only new product that's being built is down on the county of Davidson County on the border. Right. And now you put them on University driving up and down or to get to work. And then that's to get to school. Now they got to drive. And all of a sudden now you've added all these additional expenses as opposed to being closer to the core downtown. Where there is transportation. You're basically forcing folks who are now workforce people to actually have to take all these additional expenses, which just doesn't make a lot of sense. At the same time, a lot of the state agencies love suburban product. So they're kind of stuck about 20 years behind of the cycle, because now we basically have a bunch of changes, or basically a reversion of these areas where places that were affordable or workforce neighborhoods are now becoming very hip places to live. Yeah. And that's what's funny, is the highest poverty rate we have for Winston-Salem census tract wise is actually the Innovation Corridor. But at the same time, you look at it, you can't get an apartment for less than $1,600 in that place. So it's kind of interesting that looking at poverty and the census is not the exact same way, just because we've had so many new people moving into the downtown, which is a whole different socio-demographic type of group of people that are moving into these communities.
Yes, and gentrification is very real.
Yeah.
It's very real. Redlining may have been decided as of course being illegal, but gentrification rather is definitely something that is real and that we see in this community. And a lot of people say, well, gentrification really hasn't hit Winston-Salem yet. You see that more in Charlotte, and you see it more in Durham, and I beg to differ. I think we have certainly seen it here in Winston-Salem. So,
and the puzzle is right now on
byproduct of redlining. It's definitely another byproduct of redlining.
And unless we produce enough housing, and that's the issue we have right now, we have such a shortage of housing. When we built tax credit properties here in Winston-Salem, they lease up instantly. I mean, it's as fast as we can get people in. The puzzle is the more we go without producing additional housing. And when I said housing, it doesn't have to just be affordable. It's all the different gamuts of housing. We're just behind on the demographics. If we don't produce the housing, then people get creative. And then they start pioneering into neighborhoods that traditionally people have used as workforce neighborhoods. And we're already seeing that pressure out there where people are starting to say, well, wait a second, there's some houses like Ardmore that's on north of Northwest. That's a pretty cool neighborhood. And we're starting to see more and more people saying, but then in reality, there's a lot of folks who are in that neighborhood because they didn't have a choice. That's the place that they've been. Now we're displacing people out of these neighborhoods. And I think it comes to the big demographics related to North Carolina as a whole, is we're growing 150,000 people a year. And of that, over 50% of those folks are 55 and older. And of the demographic, throwing a bunch of numbers, but these are really important numbers to look at because Winston's being affected by this. Of all those seniors, people who are moving to North Carolina, over 45 or 50% of those people have incomes that are over $150,000. So you have this retired group of people coming with a lot of money. And this is what first showed up in Asheville, where we had a lot of people displaced from Asheville, where there's just no workforce places in Asheville anymore. And I think we're seeing the same thing here in Winston-Salem, is we have a big group of people that are coming in with a lot of income and have the ability to displace other people out of the neighborhoods. And so we're seeing a lot of apartments getting basically revamped or torn down. And then basically the folks who lived in there are, supposedly go find new places to live. But as Wanda knows, or a lot of the other people working on the housing issues, as soon as somebody is displaced from one of the existing, 50-year-old apartment complexes, they don't have any option. They are moving out of the county at that point because there is no other housing that they can move to. And it's a huge issue because now we basically, the puzzle, and this is the bigger issue for Winston-Salem, is without people who have places to live, then you don't have employees. And that's where it hits us on the economic side, which is when they built the mills and in the 1920s or the 1800s, they built all the mills. They built housing. They built the mill villages. Yeah. And it wasn't that they built the mill villages just to be nice and say, hey, wouldn't it be great if we built some houses next door to our mill? They built it because they had to for business, because that's employees. And I think recently on the paper, I think last week, there was an article about Winston-Salem has a shortage of 50 job openings. And they basically were expanding the driving distance people can go because they can't get people to live in this area. And the idea was to change the rules that you could actually work for Winston-Salem, the city, and live 60 miles away. Well, as the article kind of said, that gets you out to Mebane and all these other places, which are all tight housing at the same time. So we're basically shutting off our economic engine here in Winston-Salem unless we produce enough housing to keep up with the growth, even just the growth of the population, not even the growth of households.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the Fair Housing Act. We've talked about the redlining and we've touched on gentrification, but I want to tie in a little bit about the Human Relations Department and the diversity, equity, inclusion now is added into that. But Wanda, about your role there and what the department does and how you work towards ensuring that there's fair housing practices in place in Winston-Salem, and how you respond when there's issues that come up for tenants or landlords, I guess, working in the area.
Yes, and actually, thank you, Melissa. We are responsible, our department is responsible for enforcing the fair housing laws here in the city of Winston-Salem. We are a fair housing assistance program, meaning that we are a partner of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, otherwise known as HUD, to be their arm here locally to make sure we investigate any complaints of housing discrimination that may arise within the city limits. And so we have a staff of investigators who actually are responsible for doing so, but we also have a very strong outreach component to what we do. We do offer trainings to landlords and tenants to make sure that they understand that these laws are there. And if they own 4 or more houses, if there's a property owner who owns 4 or more houses, then automatically the fair housing laws are triggered and they are mandated to adhere to what the laws say. And so our local ordinance is a mirror of the Fair Housing Act, the Federal Fair Housing Act. So that means our ordinance is substantially equivalent to the Fair Housing Act. So there's nothing in our ordinance that differs from what the federal law says. And so there are 7 protected classes of persons under fair housing law. And those classes include race and color, national origin, gender. And actually for gender, it's important to say that HUD has issued guidance that says now gender also includes sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. So while there is no exclusive protected class that focuses just on sexual orientation, gender identity, and so forth, it is a subset of gender discrimination. That is how HUD has interpreted it. But anyway, we have religion, disability, familial status, and so forth. I don't think I hit all 7 of them because I interrupted myself, but anyway, we do have the 7 protected classes. And we here in Winston-Salem tend to see more complaints based on disability and also race. Those are the 2 prevalent complaints that we see the most from tenants. But also sexual harassment is another component of gender. And we have seen our fair share of allegations of sexual harassment over the years. But we definitely are here, and that is a large part of what we do. In addition to landlord-tenant law, we mediate complaints of landlords and tenants in violation of our North Carolina General Statute, Chapter 42. And that particular chapter does mandate how landlords are to behave, what their rights are, but also what their responsibilities are, and the same for tenants. And so we do attempt to mediate those types of complaints when they come in. And a third component of what we do is our new part, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion. Back in September, our Human Relations Department did merge with the Office of DEI, and now we're one big happy family as the Human Relations, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Department. And so what we're doing now is turning more of an internal lens to DEI-related concerns and issues. And so we're continuing what we've always done in terms of our public work, but now we're going to look at our internal systems. We're going to look at resources for employees to make sure that employees understand what the laws say too, in terms of equitable and fair treatment in the workplace. And so we're working on making sure that we're developing those programs and practices as we speak. And more recently, our department has also taken on enforcing 2 new ordinances that apply to employment and that apply to public accommodations. So what that means is here in Winston-Salem, if someone has a complaint based on discrimination in a public place, if they're in a restaurant, a hotel, a store, and so forth, if they feel they've been discriminated against based on one of the 17 protected classes of persons, then they can file with us. And so with those classes of persons, we've included protected statuses such as veteran status, hairstyles, pregnancy, and so forth. And you don't see those necessarily bulleted out that way under the fair housing law protections. So 7 versus 17. So the 17 protected areas pertain to not just public accommodations, but employment. So anyone who is employed within the city limits of Winston-Salem, as long as they are not state government employees, county government employees, or city government employees, they may file a complaint with us and we will investigate locally into their claim of employment discrimination. That just became effective this month. So it's a brand new area. And so we do have staff dedicated to that as well. So that just touches on a little bit of what we do. But again, the housing work that we do has not been impacted at all. So bringing it around, I don't know how we can get into any kind of discussion at this time without wondering how COVID has impacted this area. So with housing, and we talk about the eviction diversion program that's available, but it's also a time when there's the possibility for COVID to be used to benefit landlords, possibly trying to displace someone to renovate and get higher rates, higher rents. What are you looking at now with COVID and how it's impacted housing in our area and how it may impact us in the next year or two? Well, COVID definitely has come into play with what we do. And fortunately, we do have the resources to continue on with our work, whether we're working on site at City Hall or whether we're working remotely. And so we just work with the landlords and tenants over the telephone. If they have internet capabilities, we do that via virtual platforms and so forth. And now, thank goodness, with technology, we can do DocuSign. I mean, there are all kinds of things that we can do as needed. And so we have really done, I think my staff has done a great job with keeping up with that in the ways that we can with the tools and the resources that we have available to us. Now, in terms of COVID and people being displaced potentially because they may have a positive COVID test result, or they may be perceived as having a positive COVID test result, that is something that can trigger disability discrimination under fair housing law. Even just the mere perception of thinking that someone, a tenant may have COVID, if you act on that perception to their detriment, then again, you have triggered disability protections under the fair housing law. It doesn't even mean that the person necessarily has to have COVID. You think they have COVID. If you're the landlord, you think they have COVID and you're treating them differently, or you're trying to evict based on that test result and so forth, then yes, you are really walking a fine line and most likely triggering those protections under fair housing law. So the protections are out there. We have heard of those types of things going on, especially early on when COVID, when it first hit back in 2020, we were getting a few calls from residents who were concerned about that. And we had to let the landlords know that they can't use that as the sole basis for evicting a tenant. And so we've had to work through that. And I think a lot of landlords have really educated themselves on that point. And I think with the ERAP program, a lot of other eviction diversion work that we do and some other departments are doing city and county-wide, that has really helped landlords to understand how to navigate with their tenants. And so I know the landlords will say, well, we're just trying to protect other tenants and we don't know how it's spread exactly, and we don't want to take that chance. But it's not something that you can use as a sole basis to evict or to terminate someone's lease.
Yeah, and one of the things it hasn't really made much press or people have talked about it, which is the amount of damage COVID's doing to a lot of workforce folks in these communities. Yeah. There's been a lot of false information that's out there related to that, everybody's rents were basically going to be waived because of COVID. And we've had some tenants where they're on Social Security and retirement plan. They have all their income still coming, but they were under the impression that somehow the federal government was going to pay their rent because of it, who stopped paying rent. And after 4 or 5 months and they owe $10,000, they get to the point where even though they had the same income, but they may have spent it on other stuff, they find themselves getting evicted because they can't pay the rent or they haven't paid for such a long time. And what people forget is, and this is the part that hits workforce folks more than just about anyone else, is when somebody gets evicted from an apartment for cause, that's permanently on the record. I mean, when you go to bankruptcy, it gets cleared off in 5 years or 8 years. But when you end up with TRW or one of these other different credit agencies say that you basically walked out on the lease or you got evicted, that permanently stays on your record. So now every time they try to get insurance, and it's why we've basically during the pandemic, we've had very high occupancies at our properties because people have no choice, because if they don't pay the rent, or if they get evicted, it's going to be on their credit rating, and then they can't find any decent housing after that. Mm-hmm. And so but at the same time, people don't realize that, and we saw this in the Great Recession, was some of our best renters were the ones who ended up moving into houses and losing their houses and getting it on their credit rating. And as soon as you then have to try to get a new apartment or new rental anywhere else, that's the first thing they look at is your credit worthiness. And it shuts you off on that. It also shuts you off on insurance, and it affects people financially way more greatly than they ever think it will be related to your housing situation.
Housing is such a big, it affects so many different things. And even when you look at education, the schools that are in the areas, and when we talk about redlining too, the tax base that's available to support the schools in those areas that can impact the level of education that's available and the quality.
Absolutely.
It's affecting the cities, because now it used to be a new company would come to a city and they look around and they say, okay, what type of restaurants do you have? That type of stuff. Yeah. The first question I hear from a lot of cities here in Winston-Salem is, because they come to me and say, Richard, I know you do housing, can you help us? Is that they're basically trying to get new corporations or businesses to move to their cities. And the first question out of all these people's mouths is basically, where are people going to work? That are going to work here? Where are they going to live? Mm-hmm. And we saw with the chicken plant up in up north of us, basically they were trying to expand the Purdue program up there, and the city couldn't come up with the right answer that people could live around there because they couldn't produce the housing, and they decided to move to a different place for their expansion. And it's that decision is being made by businesses every day, whether or not it's publicly out there. People are making decisions whether they can find employees for these locations. And we got the two big hospital groups here in Winston-Salem. Both of them are struggling because they have people who can't find housing. And this is our two biggest employers in this county, are basically struggling to get people and to make sure people can find housing that's anywhere near close enough to these properties. And these are our folks who are taken care of, especially in the COVID sense. These are the people who are stepping up and making sure that we're addressing the health and all the rest of the things related to it.
Okay. We are about 20 minutes left in the presentation, and we've covered a lot of information. I thought we have 7 questions in the box, and I thought we'd start with one of the questions and see if we can work through these. With the goal of building out mixed use housing close to the core of downtown, can you reflect, and I was reading about this morning, on Crystal Towers, including yesterday's commitment by the city to the residents there? What are your thoughts on Crystal Towers and renovating that versus demolishing it and trying to rebuild?
I think it's smart that we're trying to figure out the housing for those individuals who live there. That's a ton of people. And it's almost like Cabrini Green in Chicago, in the sense that they tore it down and they came up with the new plans, but then nobody ever said what happened to all those people who lived in those towers. And this tower is the exact same example. No one's been able to say where they're going to move, other than, well, magically they'll all get vouchers and they'll be able to go find housing. Well, talk to Andrea over United Way. There's no magical 150 other units that are available here in Winston-Salem for those folks to move to. So I think trying to figure out something for them, either building new product that they can move into, but I think the idea that they were just going to be displaced and magically they would find other places to live, I think was a bit of a pipe dream.
And talking about the building. Oops, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, Wanda.
No, I was just going to say we've definitely received we've heard from a number of residents over at Crystal Towers over the years, and the concern is always the same. They feel as though they would have absolutely nowhere to go because they would not be able to afford to go anywhere else paying the rent that they're paying now. They know that their rent's going to go up significantly. So many of the residents over there are, of course, older and disabled and with low and limited incomes. And so we've heard it so many times. And we've had a countless number of cases from Crystal Towers, whether it was landlord-tenant based or whether it was claims of housing discrimination. And so it is really, I think, great that the renovations will occur. And I think that we will probably hear that a lot of the residents are definitely relieved because they did have some very grave concerns about what their housing situations would be like.
Yeah, and I'm sure most of us, I know my family, we've been getting offers every week to buy our house outright, but knowing what we know about the current market, it's like, well, that's fine, but will I be able to find something to move into? And so exactly. I think, yeah, and it affects homeowners, apartment dwellers. I think the supply is part of the issue right now, like you've been talking about, Richard. And so Brad asks, are there enough builders who are willing to construct affordable houses in our community? Are there programs to subsidize their efforts if they can't make any money doing so? He's, as a former Habitat for Humanity employee, who felt like we were a drop in the ocean on the affordable housing issue. So Brad had worked with Habitat for Humanity on their housing projects. And, you know, how do you get the supply of affordable housing? And then also, how do we determine what affordable means? What does that number look like?
Well, and that's a good question, because we've been asking that for folks for good housing quite a bit, which is what's affordable. Affordable in some of the cities' definition is basically a 300 square foot unit that rents for $800 in one of the towers. A lot of us have been trying to basically push that, you know, what we see as affordable is basically something that a full-size family can live in, and that it's affordable to our median income. We've had a difficulty in Winston-Salem because our median income hasn't gone up for the last 15 years. So folks who are at the median are basically making the same, but our rents have increased substantially from where they were even like 4 or 5 years ago. And I think there's plenty of developers here in Winston-Salem who can build affordable housing. And when we say affordable housing, there's multiple levels. There's what the traditional Section 8, which is subsidized housing, which is for folks who are making between, you know, below 30% of the area median income. And that's generally for people making $14,000 a year and less. You then have the workforce folks, which is people who are making up to 80% of area median income. So that would be folks making up to 52, 50, almost probably low 50s. And that's a group that are working, making income related to it. And that's the part that we really have not, the city and the county have not really set up any good structures to help make that type of housing happen. They've not been hindering it and saying, but then basically there also hasn't been the same programs that Greensboro and Asheville and Durham and a lot of the other cities have set up, which is they do large bond issuances to put in to make these work. Because when you build housing that's affordable, is probably the best way to refer to it. It costs the same as market rate.
Right.
So for a developer to decide whether they want to charge $1,600, like up at the ball field, I mean, a 1-bedroom smallest is about $1,400, $1,600. For them to do less rent than that, we're working on Peters Creek for the old Budget Inn location. And we've been trying to keep that affordable. Now, yeah, you could rent those 1-bedroom for $1,600 right in that location, but to try to build a structure that works for building affordable housing there is very difficult unless you have the city and the county basically working together and coming up with, and it fundamentally comes down to allocating money per unit for those types of properties. Most of the cities, big metros in North Carolina are putting anywhere from $40,000 to $80,000 of local money or raised money into those type of programs in order to make them happen. And this has been part of the difficulty we've been having as an organization is to be able to do that. We've actually started down a path of trying to find third-party money. So we're trying to do our own affordable program where we're actually doing a Winston-Salem Forsyth fund, where we're approaching different corporations and trying to raise money so we can put it into a workforce housing. And try to fill in some of the gaps that we have basically from the city and the county level.
Okay, thank you for that. So we have one question that goes back to the Department of Human Relations, I think, and some of the information you shared, Wanda. Can you discuss the typical timeline for investigations when a claim is made? Another hardship for someone who is already in a difficult, whoops, that one jumped off. I'm so sorry. Okay. So we'll move on to the next. I'm so sorry.
Melissa, that was my fault. I'm sorry. I was in the process of typing the response.
Oh, okay. Okay.
The question pertained to our timeline and whether or not people are provided with housing while the investigation is going on. So okay. The thing is, we have a 100-day turnaround timeline. That is always our goal, is to, from the start of the investigation to its conclusion, which means that is when the investigator makes a recommendation to me in terms of what they believe has occurred and whether or not it evidences discrimination has occurred. And then I will in turn make a reasonable cause determination as to whether or not, yes, there's reasonable cause to believe that discrimination has occurred, or no, there is no reasonable cause. And if I find that there's reasonable cause, then it moves on to the city attorney's office, and that case is prepared for litigation, and it becomes the city of Winston-Salem versus whomever. And so no, there is no automatic way for tenants or anyone who happen to be complainant to be temporarily housed elsewhere. Oftentimes when we initiate those fair housing investigations, oftentimes, now not always, the landlord will kind of like stave off any kind of eviction processes and proceedings. Usually they will just put a hold on all of that until the investigation has concluded. But again, that is not always the case. So I think that addressed the questions that were in that.
Specific to that. Thank you. All right, so back to, we have Deborah who asked future vision. How would progressive design change the way equitable communities of the future be designed to keep us healthier in the face of COVID-type pandemics? So how would progressive design change the way equitable communities of the future, the design of them, to help keep us healthier? Any ideas there?
That's a good question, because originally I was thinking about like COVID, but I don't, you're basically creating situations, but in reality, it comes down to, and I think, some of my friends who were over, with the medical facilities basically bring up, when people don't have reliable housing, that puts on so many medical issues related to that. And then as a society, we then see that because people are going to the emergency room because of it. I think having stable housing is the most important thing for anyone to be good at school, it kind of flows through everyone else. If you can't take a shower and you don't have, you don't have a unit that's big enough for you and your family to live in, it's difficult to go to school and go to work, which then affects them on how much income they make. And it's kind of a spiral that kind of goes off from housing. At the same time, most folks who are renting nowadays are spending 50% of their income on housing. Yeah. And so if they have some uncertainty about their housing, especially displacement or whether they're going to be able to stay in their unit or not, you know, that's such a huge number that mentally affects you very quickly. And so having a shortfall, because right now the number is officially that we have 14,000 households, too little of housing for Winston. I mean, that affects a lot of people, and that's not people who are in the top 5% earners. They're not worried about where they're going to live. It's pushing it down to the lower income folks and the workforce folks, which is a shame. And one of the things we've been really speaking out about is we got to figure out how to, you know, we build a lot of really high-end apartments downtown. We need to build a lot of really good workforce housing units downtown. And not that, you know, they need to be at the border of Davidson County. They should be downtown where they can walk to the jobs and use the restaurants and everything else, just like everybody is that are spending $2,000 a month for the big Texas donuts that are downtown.
And that this leads into that is Gary's wondering if you, Richard, could sharpen the line between workforce housing and the two largest employers, the healthcare employers here.
Yeah, it was one of the questions in Gary's, you know, along the way here, we kind of asked that question, which is how many people working at the hospitals, what's the income brackets? And I think an unofficial kind of just back of the envelope was that a good over half of the people who work in the hospitals and clean the rooms and do all the rest of the work. You always think of the doctors as as high income people. But in reality, they make up a very small component of the employees for these locations. And so you have a lot of folks who all qualify for workforce housing. So like the Peters Creek, Flats of Peters Creek, which is the old Budget Inn location. I mean, that would be 74 units of housing that 60%, 70% of the folks who work at Baptist could qualify and live in. Yeah. And so when they have people living in their cars, in their parking lots, which is the situation, both of them have that situation. A lot of these employers have people living in their cars. It would provide places for people to be able to easily get back and forth to work. And I think that's a really good example of what's happening. I think back to your original question related to, do we have people here within Winston-Salem who can build this stuff? We have a ton of really good experienced people. And I think that's the frustration that a lot of us have, and folks for good housing has been kind of expressing, is we got to stop doing the studies and hiring people from faraway places to tell us about our housing situations we have here in Winston-Salem. We know we have a shortage. We know what it costs to build this product. I mean, the whole thing is just connecting the dots and saying, okay, how do we come up with enough money to make market rate, or, the not market rate stuff work, the workforce housing and also the subsidized housing? How do we get enough money to fill in the gap for that part of the population? And that's the part people kind of forget. That's like 60, 70% of our population we're talking about. So it's not like this little minority group of people. It's a big majority of the people who live in Forsyth County fall into these categories of being workforce people. And when we kind of shut off the money and don't have it going into that, that's really not good for us, both on just the environment and the community. It's also difficult for us as employers, for us to find the people to work in our communities. And it gives people the ability to say, well, maybe I should be working in Mebane or living in Mebane. And that's not right for Forsyth County, because we got to keep constantly figuring out how do we get more jobs and places for people to live here.
Yeah, it really is a struggle right now for most of the employers running short-staffed, and mostly in the workforce.
And it was kind of funny. We talked recently because the COVID money came out related to the county.
Yeah.
And there was a series of us who all put in, we were all told that there was going to be money available for housing. There was about 8 applications that were applied for housing. And we basically all got pulled out because the county says that their job is not housing. Well, Mecklenburg just raised $200 million for housing as the county for Charlotte. And they clearly see that housing is an important thing for the county because they see it as jobs. It's jobs. And if you need housing, we'll figure out how to get housing if we can get more jobs. And so basically all the housing properties got pulled out of COVID with the logic that basically, you know, that is not something the county needs to address, which I think is pretty sad, because then basically we're saying, well, our employers have to be basically bringing people in from other places. What was interesting about that meeting was at the end of the meeting, the county, you know, board basically then talked about the 12 jobs where people have retired and they can't hire anybody. And I'm kind of sitting there listening to this, you know, over webinar just like this, going, well, you know what? If they had housing, you could entice people to come work for Forsyth County. And then that's the same thing where the city just has, you know, 50 openings that they're now trying to figure out because of the housing issues. The major thing, people aren't being able to take the job. So it's a vicious cycle. And we as a city and a county, and when I say city and county, it's all of us people who live here. Sure. We are falling behind other locations because people have, you know, basically Greensboro did a $26 million fund to do workforce housing. And they basically put all that money to work. In 3 years, they had all that money at work, and it's all new units that are built there for people to live in. We need to do the same thing here in Forsyth County, is basically figure out, okay, because I think if you get it up to the elected, you know, if you put it out to the electorate and say, okay, would people want to have housing and would they want to do a bond issue? Few places have ever turned down because they understand that 60% of our folks qualify for that stuff. We just need to basically step up to the plate and say, we need housing because of all these other issues. Let's figure out how to get the money into the housing.
All right. Well, we're right at the top of the hour now. This has gone so fast and there's been so much information. For each of you, if there's something that you would love to see happen in the next year or so that would definitely impact access and equity to fair and affordable housing, what do you think one of the first steps would be?
Well, I think from our perspective, a really good thing to see happen would be the implementation of a right to counsel program. And we have already undertaken that as city government. And what a right to counsel program is basically a way for tenants to be able to have access to legal advice, legal guidance from an entity such as legal aid to help them to understand how to divert eviction. So if there's a way to mediate with landlords to keep people in the housing that they have, then I think that would be pretty impactful. Because a part of what we're seeing, a part of this whole thing that we're talking about also touches on the eviction rate. You know, we have one of the highest eviction rates here in the United States. And so it is really unfortunate, and it just compounds an already very complicated and deep problem that we have with housing and housing access and availability and affordability. And so if we can help people to stay in housing, not only does that benefit tenants, but it also benefits landlords because they don't have to go through the expense of going to court and trying to, you know, mitigate whatever losses they have and getting new tenants and so on. But that's something that I think could really have a positive impact. And so we're actively working right now, like I said, with legal aid and trying to make sure that we establish a right to counsel program. It is a model program that has been very successful in many, many cities and across the United States. And I don't think that Winston-Salem would be any different as long as we can get that underway. So I'm optimistic because we've already laid the groundwork for it. And so I just think that that would be really helpful.
And can anyone listening today help you in that effort? Is there anything that we can do to help?
Well, funding is always an issue. And right now the city has committed to funding this first leg or phase of the Right to Counsel program. And they've committed funding for that. And that funding will probably help out for about a year, but we do need funding to help to get this ball rolling and to hopefully show that the community supports this type of effort. And so just voicing support for it. And if you have any suggestions or resources for entities or organizations that may be interested in partnering on this type of project, then certainly I would think that that would be welcome.
Okay, wonderful. And Richard, how about you?
I would think, I mean, the big thing that would help is for people just to be reasonable. Housing is one of those ones where there's so many polar views on it. And there's so many things that I know the city and the county are trying to do right now to address the housing shortage that we have right now. The puzzle is they can't do anything if the communities are not reasonable about it. And a perfect example of that is the ancillary units, which are basically the granny flats. I mean, the city has spent the last year and a half working on the ability to put, I mean, my office is above my garage in Buena Vista, was built in the 1920s. It's an apartment. And it's not a scary thing, but then we've watched what's happened. Like, this is a perfect little example of how this can go bad. Is we have all these folks who are against having the ability to put ancillary units or granny flats in people's backyards. And some of the stories I've heard, like, you're going to now have 8 additional cars parked in the front, on the street. Well, most of these units are 700 square feet, which is like a studio apartment. You're not having 8 people live in one of these things. So, but at the same time, we've had a lot of people kind of say, hey, we got houses. We don't want anyone else to be in houses, which is kind of what Wanda was mentioning related to the fundamentals of some of the redlining, which was, let's keep those people out of our areas. Yeah. And I think the puzzle with is a lot of other states and a lot of other cities, even in North Carolina, they basically have made ancillary units as something, well, if you can, you build it, they cost $140,000 probably to build an ancillary unit. So you're not putting random people in your backyard. But then at the same time, there's a lot of people who are very vocal who are kind of against anything like apartments, housing, anything, corner stores, anything that kind of breaks up kind of this 100 years worth of kind of telling people that the best and the only place people should live is in a single family house. Yeah. And that if people aren't in a single family house, you have to worry about those people because they're renters. And what's funny with renters, and I know we're running over time, is a lot of these renters who are in these towers or in these things, they make more income than single family house folks around there. And it's one of these fallacies that, I see this from other cities where people are all saying, those are renters. And it's like, yeah, but your renters have twice the income that all the people who have the single family houses around the apartment building actually have. So it's not a scary group of people. It's just the way people choose to have their housing. It's a rental, buying, living with other people. None of that's good or bad. It's just, we've got to figure out how to have more people live in the same footprint that we have.
Yeah. Getting everyone housed really is the key.
You really do.
Yeah. Wouldn't it be great to be able to put shelters out of business, that we just don't need them, that there's a space for everyone.
Exactly. Right. And we got, unfortunately, and that's a whole nother topic for another day, we got a lot of people living, not in houses or rentals right now across this state.
Right. So, gosh, I wish we could have solved something today, but I think we definitely had a lot of conversations, and hopefully people will take these conversations offline and continue them and support the work that you're all doing to help both create more housing for people and make sure that we keep people in housing when we can, when situations arise. So I really appreciate your time, both of you. Thank you for sharing your time and expertise with us today. I'm going to go ahead and hand the mic back to, I think, Catherine to close up. And I hope everyone has a good rest of the month.
Well, thanks,
Melissa,
for having us.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Wanda. I appreciate your time today. We've gotten a lot of positive feedback in the chat. This was a really great discussion, and I think something that we could all stand to learn more about and learn more about our community and take an investment into it. I would like to thank all the people that joined us on the call today. We had up to 92 participants outside of our panelists that were a part of our call. We do this every month. Next month, our focus will be healthcare, and our lunch and learn is scheduled for February the 16th at noon. The particular topic is to be decided. So keep your eyes peeled on your email. We'll send out an announcement about that in the coming weeks. So thank you again so much. Everybody be careful out there in the snow and bad weather that we're about to have again. We hope to see you in a month's time. With that concludes our Lunch and Learn today. I would like to request that Melissa, Shula, and Jared stay on the call for just a moment. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.